we want to tell you about another podcast from PRX called Monumental. This podcast explores questions about the past, present, and future of U.S. monuments, uncovering the stories about what and who is important, as well as the stories that have been left out. Join host Ashley Seaford across the country with their team of journalists. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, December 12th, 2000, after a months-plus state of limbo with vote counting and legal procedures and finally an intervention by the Supreme Court, the 2000 election finally comes to a close. We've talked a lot about that contested 2000 election on this show, the razor-thin number of votes in Florida, the hanging chads on the ballots. We haven't actually talked about how it finally came to an end, and that was with the Supreme Court intervening late at night on the night of December 12th, and then a concession speech by Al Gore on the morning of the 13th, in which he conceded the race to George W. Bush. And that is really the focus of today's episode, and we will get into the many fascinating things that Gore said in that speech. The salient line is probably this one, where he says, quote, "Let there be no doubt, while I strongly disagree with the court's decision, I accept it." And then he would say in the end, "Partisan rancor must now be put aside." So let's revisit that speech now, maybe discuss how the idea of setting aside partisan rancor after losing an election, how that idea plays today here in 2024. And of course, we will touch on the twisty-turny run-up to that speech. With us to help do that is one of our favorite guests, friends of the show, Leon Neyfakh, creator of Slow Burn and host of the Audible series Fiasco. Fiasco did a series about Bush v. Gore several years ago, and it was recently brought out from behind the Audible paywall and available for all to listen to now wherever you get your podcasts. So Leon is putting his fall of 2000 hat back on to join us. Leon, thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
And here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody. Hey there.
A little inside baseball, Leon. You decided to re-release this Bush v. Gore thing. In your clever media savviness, you were like, oh, this will be great. This will be out right at the moment the 2024 election is super contested. And of course, that election was not contested. And here we go. But still.
I know. We all thought it was going to be so close.
Yeah. Exactly. Still very much worth revisiting. And you and I were talking about what angle from the race we could pick. And I am just very interested in the concession speech itself. I think it's one of the kind of forgotten moments of the many twists and turns. I feel like even the documentaries I've seen about 2000 just stop when the Supreme Court issues their unsigned docket late at night and doesn't really focus on the thing that actually brought this to a close, which was Gore's concession speech. What do we know about it? He gives it from the White House. It's not in the Oval Office, which he's not going to be entering anymore, but he does give it from the White House. What does he say aside from the stuff I just read?
This speech was given after 36 days of extremely intense and at times tedious wrangling in the courts and in the streets at certain points over who was the true winner of this election. Obviously, your listeners know it all had come down to Florida, and for over a month, there were questions about how the votes should be counted. Both the Bush side and the Gore side had views on how to interpret ballots that were not unambiguously for one candidate or the other. In some cases, this was for undervotes where it wasn't clear who the person had voted for because they had not fully punched through the ballot for either candidate. In some cases, it was because of overvotes where it seemed like they had voted for more than one candidate. We won't have to go into all that. Gore certainly did not in this concession speech. I think that's part of its power, is it came after all this very nitpicky, ticky-tack tallying up of individual votes. As you mentioned, the margin was so thin that even an increase of 12 votes for Gore in a certain county seemed like an important development. I think part of the power of the speech is that he does not get into any of these details. It is final. It is simple. Yeah. There are no asterisks. There are no what ifs. There's no talk of chads. Actually, Chad. Right. I should mention the plural of Chad is Chad, not Chads.
There's right. A breakthrough.
I know.
Yep. One of the scoops in our show. I think Gore, if you watch the video of him giving the speech, he's kind of smiling throughout. Yeah. He has almost like a laughy tone to his remarks. He's clearly trying to signal that he is at peace with what has happened, despite the perception that he was a sore loser. People may remember sore loserman T-shirts that were printed in response to Gore contesting the election results. He tries to come across as magnanimous, as putting country above party and above himself, his own ambitions. And he's trying to signal that everything's going to be okay. And what does he say specifically besides for we will respect this outcome and we will respect the rule of law and the decision of the Supreme Court? Not much, right? Like, I mean,
it's only 7 minutes, right?
Yeah, it's short.
And I think he probably, saw it as his duty to make sure that none of the people who had felt so strongly that he was the true winner would proceed with the feeling that he had been cheated or that had been stolen. I think he wanted everyone to be okay with it. That's the tone that you read.
And for it to be clean.
Yeah. He wanted there to be no more questions after this.
There really was a sense, like the theme of the speech is healing the divide. And it is notable that the historical moment that he starts with is Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860. At the moment, the country is so fractured. Obviously, it will get much more fractured after. But he quotes Stephen Douglas, who was yielding to Abraham Lincoln, who said, "Partisan feeling must yield to patriotism." And this is an old note in concession speeches and in transition between parties. When Thomas Jefferson won against John Adams, and it's the first time that power is transferring from one party to another, Thomas Jefferson says in his inaugural address, which is different than a concession speech, but in his inaugural address, he says, "We are all Federalists. We are all Republicans." This idea that the election is over, now we must come together. And that is very much the note that Gore strikes in this speech. Very magnanimous, but very much, there is no red America. There is no blue America. There is only the United States of America is very much the tone of the speech.
Yeah. And no regrets. And the only regret, he says, is that he could not. And he did not get a chance to appease his base and the voters and the people who were championing for him. He didn't get to lead them in the way that he wanted to do. But other than that, it has a very much sort of no regrets kind of moment. And this is done. And thank you for your time. And I'm going to enjoy the holidays with my family.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah. Gore out. You know what I mean?
Well,
he says at one point, "I've seen America in this campaign, and I like what I see. It's worth fighting for." I think I really like that. I like what I see.
Yeah. Well, Leon, your point about kind of his affect, I think, is worthwhile. I mean, he's giving across of a calmness, right? Let's lower the temperature. Let's move on. He even manages to squeeze in a joke. He says, "I spoke with George W. Bush and congratulated him on becoming the 43rd president of the United States. And I promised him that I wouldn't
back."
And I promised that I wouldn't. No, that's the line. You should have written the speech. And I promised that I wouldn't call him back because he had famously on the night of the election conceded and then called back and been like, "Wait a minute, do you know about these things, Chads?" Chad. But he squeezes in a joke. But Leon, if we're taking, and I want to get into this, whether this is how we totally should read this speech, but if we're taking this kind of sense of we fought the fight, let's move on, let's concede, is that because, and your piece gets into the super long fight over the preceding month, is it because Gore can stand up there basically saying to himself, like, you know what, we tried everything and it is what it is. And so you can be pissed, but we sort of emptied the chamber in terms of our options. Is that part of what's going on in his sort of desire, or is he really glossing over a bunch of things that maybe there were ways in which they could have continued to fight it?
I mean, I think if he had wanted to, he could have thought of some regrets, even just in those 36 days. I think there are lots of decisions you can second guess in retrospect. I suspect he thought he did his best. I suspect he thought that they did everything they could. The truth was, by this point, the time was up. That was really the operative thing, right? The Supreme Court, when they intervened, it was right on the brink of the deadline for states seating their electors. And so it would have been, if the recount had continued past, I think, December 12th, we would have been in uncharted territory in that whatever, insofar as there was like a rock solid train track that was there to ensure that this election would end and the results would translate into a result, and that the result would lead to a transition, and the transition would lead to a presidency. Like these deadlines, these rules, like all of them in a vacuum are seemingly insignificant. Okay, fine. So the deadline is December 12th. Like, why don't you just change it? But I think there's something, I don't know, it's hard to say with a straight face that it's inspiring, but there's a notable respect for these rules in the way they played this game, right? The January 6th mob compare that to the way both sides approached this process. You could say everything you want about how maybe the Bush side used, illegitimate tactics to try to like swing momentum in their direction. I'm referring here to the Brooks Brothers riot, a little mini January 6th in Miami-Dade County. But I think like at the bottom of it was a shared understanding that these little rules that like we got to seat our electors by this day, and that's just how it is. Like there's an agreement that it, in fact, that was how it was, and that we can't afford to go into uncharted waters by blowing through these deadlines, even though they're all made up. And by certain light, the most important rule was that we needed to elect the guy who got more votes. You would think like that spiritual kind of mandate of the election would be the most important thing. But I think there's something, and this is why I said it, there's something inspiring about it. Like, it strikes me that putting so much weight in these little rules in the name of upholding the bigger rule is interesting.
But he has clearly in this a eye towards the larger picture and the larger, I am struck reading back at this. He doesn't say like, well, I guess that guy got more votes and I guess the rules shook out this way. But he mostly appeals, I would say, he talks about God's will, the democracy, the closing ranks, rancor, but then, the way that America has always done this. He says this is, and he acknowledges, he's like, I know a lot of you, he says, I know that many of my supporters are disappointed. I am too, but our disappointment must be overcome by our love of country.
Yeah,
so
it's
like
country first.
Yeah, but he's like calling it very clearly in a way that I don't think I'd remembered. Like in my head, I remembered a kind of like hangdog, I guess this is over kind of thing. But he is actually really doing a clarion call to these higher ideals.
And for anyone who would, I think, understandably view that with some skepticism and say, okay, I get that he's saying this and I get that he has to say this. Obviously, on the inside, he was furious and believed this outcome to be illegitimate. I actually don't know. Yeah. There's a detail that really stuck with me about these last hours of the recount process when the Supreme Court, I can't remember if it's after the ruling came down or when they stayed the Florida Supreme Court's decision to order a statewide recount, which was a couple days earlier. Gore tapped out a message to all of his aides on his BlackBerry that said, please make sure that no one trashes the Supreme Court. So this is like an order to any surrogate that might be going on TV to talk about the stay. I'm pretty sure it was the stay that prompted him to say this. That's a private communication, right? To me, that seems like a genuine expression of deference and towards the Supreme Court, towards the idea of institutional legitimacy in general.
It's interesting because I think that the 2000 election and the recount and this moment have become so much more important in the story that we tell about U.S. democracy in the years since. And when I teach this and when I look back at this, I see an election that wasn't decided by who won the most votes. It was an election decided by the Supreme Court. And whether at the end of the day one side won more than the other, that's not what ultimately decided the election. And I think that there are a lot of problems with that. I think that the Brooks Brother riot actually does foreshadow some of the violence that we would see later. And I think that Gore's concession speech is so much more critically important and worth so much more study now, because now we see what was it that was holding democracy together all this time. It was this. It was an appeal to institutional legitimacy. It was a willingness to say, I don't agree with this ruling, but if I do anything other than move forward at this point and accept it, I'm going to be at the center of a crisis that could collapse this entire system, because actually it is held together by some combination of norms and force. And if I don't do the norms, then we're going to be in the force sector of this conversation, and I don't want to be there. So it makes the work that Gore is doing in this moment so important, because it reveals to us actually how our system works. And even just the almost rhetorical ways in which it's been held together, even in these times of real institutional legitimacy crises.
Yeah, absolutely. And because people are at the ready on both sides, I think, to protest, to rise up, to say, put me in, coach, we're ready. Like the idea that people were like, wait, he's conceding, because that really does shut it on. You can't keep fighting when the person that you're championing has basically taken themselves out of the fight. So there's no way to keep petitioning, basically. But I remember that very well. I remember being in college and like, we're marching, we're protesting. And I remember like all of the critics and Jesse Jackson, he's president-elect. Like he wouldn't call him president-elected. All of this stuff, like I just remember the feeling of, for the first time, at least in my young adult life, questioning the legitimacy or the efficacy of voting and campaigns and outcomes and how this all comes to fruition. It just, you could go down a rabbit hole with how you want to play this out.
And Jesse Jackson we should point out, there were voices at the time who were calling this decision illegitimate, who were pushing back, who were seeing, you're right, Niki, this notion of this being a sort of hinge point where some people were holding on to an idea that may no longer have existed, and some people were seeing the writing on the wall. And I think there were people who were calling out the nature of this decision and saying, continue to fight. So I don't want to portray it as Gore got up there, spoke, and everyone was mollified.
Yeah.
Hey, it's Jody, and as you likely know, it is the Radiotopia fundraiser right now, and more specifically, it is nearing the end of the Radiotopia fundraiser. Now, before you throw confetti in the air to celebrate, I do have to say there is still time for those of you who have not supported to become members of Radiotopia. And we have a goal of 2,024 donors before the end of the year. We are just about halfway there, so some work to do. If you are one of those hang around and see kind of people, now is the time. If you're listening to this sentence that I'm speaking right now, take a moment to think about what that means. It means you're the kind of person who likes this show enough that you are still listening to a fundraiser pitch let me look at my watch here, about 27 seconds into this thing. That probably means you like this show and you like the work that I and Niki and Kellie, not to mention Jacob and Brittany and Kala, do. By supporting, you're helping us make exactly the show we want, but also casting a vote for independent media, which needs all of the help it can get right now. $20, $5 a month, $10 a month, $7,000 a month. Figured I'd throw that out there just in case. Anything you can do to go from listener to supporter at whatever level works for you, it means so much. And as a token of our gratitude, when you donate today, you will also get access to the list of our favorite things curated by me and all of the producers at Radiotopia. It is actually a pretty incredible collection of recommendations. So head on over to radiotopia.fm/donate to donate today. Write a little note saying you're supporting this day. Once again, that's radiotopia.fm/donate. And thank you so much. As you start to think about the gifts you'll get people this holiday season, keep in mind that it is really wonderful when you can get someone a gift that they wouldn't necessarily get for themselves. Maybe a little bit of luxury that they don't know that they're missing. For quality gifts at an affordable price, my go-to is Quince. Quince lets you treat your loved ones or yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price. Honestly, I think of Quince as that secret hack that your most stylish friend has. You're always wondering, how do they know the angles to step up their style game? Well, this is the angle. You can get a cashmere sweater for $50. I, not the most stylish person in the world, but someone who likes to step it up from time to time, I have a pair of linen pants from Quince, $49. I got a linen shirt to pair with it, $29. That's right, I'm going head to toe linen. I do that from time to time. Quince has got jewelry, Italian leather handbags, European sheet sets, whatever you're looking for. All Quince items are priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. And they're able to do that because they partner directly with top factories, cutting out the cost of the middleman, passing the savings right on to you. So it's time to gift luxury this holiday season without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/thisday for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/thisday to get free shipping and 365-day returns. All right, now you know the secret hack. Quince.com/thisday.
One thing that I wanted to throw out here is we talk, obviously, for good reason, about how honorable this gesture is, how important it was to the health of our democracy for him to call for acceptance. But like, what if you really think that this was a legal coup by the Supreme Court, by the Republicans in the Supreme Court? What if you really think that this decision was illegitimate?
Which is what a lot of my friends did. The resignation, the kind of that my vote doesn't matter or none of this actually matters, that also seeps into the system as well and weakens it, because if it can just be left up to the courts,
right,
then
but I guess that goes to that fundamental question of, do they legitimately feel like they'd exhausted every option, right?
But I think there's actually a little bit more to what Leon's asking, which is, I don't think that it was a legitimate resolution, because it was the Supreme Court making the decision. It was obviously a partisan split on the Supreme Court. And I do think that even though Al Gore did the work that was necessary to keep the system together, there wasn't a reckoning with how broken the system was. And that rot within the institution in both the Supreme Court and in the kind of gamesmanship that took over, the partisanship that took over, the need to have the person who won the most votes be the person who won the election, continued to corrode the system.
Yeah.
And I think we're still living in the aftermath of the 2000 election. And even though, again, Gore did the thing that made the system keep working, he didn't do the thing that would lead to fixing the system.
And arguably, like, he lent legitimacy to what many believe was an illegitimate act.
Yeah.
And so, like, I'm thinking of my friends at the 5-4 podcast and what they would say about this. I think they would argue they're very consistent on this point of view. Like, the deference to ticky-tack rules, like the one that says that electors have to be seated on December 12th or whatever in the name of some bigger goal, is exactly the wrong approach. Like, when you're faced with an illegitimate act like the Supreme Court decision, it in fact is not honorable to bless it and act like it's like it, you have to accept, like everyone should just accept it. And so, yeah, I think I share the feeling that I think we've all expressed here, like that there was something no doubt magnanimous and mature and selfless even about Gore's posture here. I think there's a less flattering way to look at it, which is, yeah, you propped up this system, didn't deserve to be propped up.
Does it make a difference to any of you, or would it make a difference to your friends at the 5-4 podcast that he does say, "Let there be no doubt, I strongly disagree with the court's decision"? He says that pretty plainly.
I listen to a lot of 5-4. And I don't think it would make a difference to them.
I don't think it would make a difference to them, that's for sure, yeah.
No.
And I think it's important that he says that he disagrees with it. But he's also saying, even if you find something that the Supreme Court did illegitimate, even if you think it is both legally and morally wrong, you defer to it anyway.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, and I think that is one of the key things here, is that more than anything, this belies a kind of understanding of the role and legitimacy of the court that has been, I think, rightly put into much more question. And this may have been the first moment in the modern era to really start to poke holes in that. And so Gore was maybe playing a game that was just ending. And it's worth just thinking about the sort of hinge point that he's in. But can I ask all a larger sort of question about this idea of like norms versus, I guess, just about norms? And like, we're in a moment now, obviously Trump broke a norm, but also just like broke the system in terms of what he did around the 2020 election. But this conversation feels related to me to what we saw recently, where Biden welcomed Trump into the White House and they did a photo op together, which is a sort of traditional norm. And that doesn't have anything to do with the sort of certification and contesting the election, but it's part of that kind of peaceful transfer of power. And so when you think about that, and I think rightly Democrats say conceding elections and peaceful transfer of powers is one of the bedrocks of democracy. But where is there a line somewhere in there between the kind of performative norms and the kind of actual abiding by the process, the legitimacy of the process?
When I imagine the alternative, I'm like, what was he supposed to do? Like, maybe it's my lack of political imagination, but like, really seemed like it was over. I don't think he had any moves left. And I know Jody, you're moving beyond just this concession speech when you're talking about norms in general. But even when you think about Biden hosting Trump for a photo op, okay, so let's say he doesn't do that. Let's say he makes a statement by refusing to participate in that. I think if you're Biden, you have to have a justification for that. You have to have a goal-oriented justification for that. So what would be the goal? Like, undermine Trump's legitimacy, denying him this ceremony that we've bestowed on every president-elect. On what basis, right? He won the election. Like, I don't know, maybe it's the wrong move here to focus specifically on 2024. But I think maybe what you're getting at, right, is that at what point does the upholding of these norms become a way to paper over things that shouldn't be happening? If
Clinton didn't invite Bush, like if Clinton was like, no, we're not going to do a photo op and you can't sit with us, like that kind of, I think that would have also undermined Gore's ability to try to bring this to a close. Like, he needed everyone to be on board. But then again, I don't know. I'm torn because I think also a lot of this has to do with maybe personality and I don't know necessarily that if this were another president, if this were Clinton, would he have conceded in this way? If this were Bush, would he have conceded in this way? I felt like a lot of people thought that Gore was a pushover.
Which I think gets to like the idea of doing what you're supposed to do, right? Like, he gave this concession because you're supposed to, and that's how we've all agreed to play this game. I think the Gore post-game strategy, they see a lot of instances of them doing things they think they have to do because that's how things are done, and maybe that's a recipe for losing sometimes.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question, Jody, because I've been thinking about this a lot. And obviously the importance of norms has been a conversation for the past 8 years, but also this idea of we have to act appropriately and we have to honor the office and we have to treat the person who holds the office as honorable. And that's what norms do, right? They assume that the person who is in office is going to not just play by a certain set of rules, but is going to adhere to a certain set of values. And I think that's a mistake. I think that we too often, we treat these offices as grandiose and honorable when we should treat them as the spoils of election that are likely filled with not just normal people, but venal people. And then we should put a lot more rules on them, a lot more laws around them, and we should constrain the power of them. Because what happens when you have somebody who's not trying to act honorably is that you get all of this. And also I think that the way we think historically, and Leon, so much of your work has charted this, the people who have held this office a significant amount of the time act in ways that dishonor the office.
Yeah. Bunch of freaks.
And they are a bunch of freaks. They're a bunch of freaks. And we paper over sometimes the fact that they are acting very dishonorably. And if we would treat the office as a place where a lot of dishonor happens, then maybe we would constrain it a little bit more than we do.
There's another element in what you were just saying, too, and what we're seeing, I think, play out with Biden. I think that, and this is the part that kind of just rubs me the wrong way about, say, the photo op with Trump in the office. I think there's part of Biden that not only thinks this is upholding a norm that is important for our democracy, but moreover, doing this will shame Trump and show him how to. And that's the part that really grinds my gears. And I don't think Trump could give a shit, if he gets invited to the White House for a photo op, or he's not going to feel bad about the fact that Biden is acting in a way that upholds norms and he doesn't. And so that's the part I think, to me, there's a line there, another half-formed thought, Niki, but something about upholding a norm for its own sake and is not going to shame anyone or prove anything. Now, upholding it because you really feel like it's a bedrock to something you believe in that goes, far beyond this moment in time. And again, I come back to what Gore does here, where I do think he is casting that higher, that higher purpose and that higher calling.
I do think getting rid of the language of norms is actually really important, because norms are only norms if everyone agrees to them. That's the whole definition.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So stop talking about them as norms. Talk about them as values.
And structures and procedures. Exactly. That's a really good point. All right. I want to throw one more thing into the pot here and get all of you to react, just because I have a sort of personal... I thought about this concession speech a lot, and in part because, or mostly because, I think all of you listeners may know, my first job was at WNYC, where I worked as a producer with the great Brian Lehrer, who I think is the best radio host in the history of the world, someone I really admire. And Brian would talk on air, and then when he and I would talk a lot about this particular moment, and he would talk about it, he would bring it up a lot and talk about how it was really one of the sort of key moments in modern political history where he saw all the things that we're talking about, how Gore went out of his way to concede gracefully and accept the ruling, but also to do this higher calling towards the rule of law and the way that sort of this country can move forward. And Brian talked about how this country was right on the brink when Gore walked us back. So I emailed Brian yesterday and asked him kind of all these years later, going through the Trump years, what does he make of that moment now? And does he still feel that way? And he wrote me back yesterday and said, yes, like he says that I still think about that moment a lot. He actually says he told a story about it on the air a couple weeks ago, but he says, he said it was like an expression of humility over ego and an act of preservation of our democracy. And he also said that embedded somewhere in here, it was the idea that like, look, if you think this was an illegitimate decision, then you got to win an election and appoint the right justices. And that's the way that you actually change these things going forward. The other thing he mentioned was that he was on the air in 2000, and he said there were a lot of callers who were like pissed at Gore. Again, we should remember that this wasn't this kind of like he brought us all together, but there were a lot of people who were calling it out. But it was just interesting to get Brian's perspective after these many years.
In addition to humility, I would also say that it reflects like a certain amount of optimism, perhaps misplaced in retrospect, that like it is going to be fine. Yes, the other guy won, but it's going to be fine. Like our democracy is strong. Like it will survive the wrong guy winning. I think there's like some of that in the smiles that he gives and the kind of lighthearted. At one point, he does laugh. He says, "It's been an extraordinary election," and he laughs. There was this cute, quirky thing that we all just did, and I think the premise of that is that like it's not that serious. Like it's going to be fine. Of course, that does look a little bit foolhardy in retrospect.
One little final tidbit, Leon, does this guy Eli Addy show up in your piece? Do you know him? Did you interview him?
Yeah, we interviewed him.
He co-wrote the speech, right?
Yes, he co-wrote the speech and then later wrote on The West Wing. We interviewed him. I think he's in the show. I'm pretty sure he's in the show.
It's been a while. But I mean, there's another little interesting tidbit.
Maybe he's not. No, because I just re-listened to the show. And so I think I would be able to tell you for sure that if he is. We must have cut him. Yeah, we must have cut him.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. The guy who co-wrote this with Gore, and I think is largely responsible for some of this laudable language. He talked about another sort of prescient moment of where things were headed in the political and Hollywood nexus. This guy then goes on to write for The West Wing. He writes for House. He writes for Billions. He's currently a writer on that Netflix show, The Diplomat. He was the Jon Favreau and Jon Lovett before Jon Favreau and Jon Lovett.
And a cynic would say, there you go. That proves it. This speech is just like a fantasy right. of how we wish things were.
It's very Sorkin-esque, right?
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Should we leave it there? I guess so.
So sadly,
I'm really glad we got to this.
To leave it there.
Exactly. I know. I'm really glad we got to this. And again, the full series on Bush v. Gore is out now for people to listen to wherever you get your podcasts. And we've been wanting to get to this particular moment for a long time. So Leon, thank you so much for doing this. And
thank you so much for having me, guys. So much fun.
Keep up the great work. What's the next? Can you tell us what the next fiasco is going to be?
I don't know what the next fiasco is going to be. We're working on a show right now that's in a different mode. Not a fiasco, different show.
You'll come on no matter what it is. And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Let there be no doubt. While I strongly disagree with the court's decision, I accept it. I accept the finality of this outcome, which will be ratified next Monday in the Electoral College. And tonight, for the sake of our unity as a people and the strength of our democracy, I offer my concession. This has been an extraordinary election, but in one of God's unforeseen paths, this belatedly broken impasse can point us all to a new common ground, for its very closeness can serve to remind us that we are one people with a shared history and a shared destiny. I know that many of my supporters are disappointed. I am too. But our disappointment must be overcome by our love of country. And I say to our fellow members of the world community, let no one see this contest as a sign of American weakness. The strength of American democracy is shown most clearly through the difficulties it can overcome.
Radiotopia.